I now call to order the Society's 2,491st meeting in what is now the 152nd year since its founding on March 13th, 1871. Good evening, everyone. It's wonderful to see the room full again after suffering through Zoom-only COVID and then decreased levels of attendance here in the Powell, although not online. My name is Larry Milstein. I'm the president of PSW, one of the oldest scientific societies of Washington, D.C., committed to providing a forum to further scientific understanding and inquiry. Welcome to our members, guests, and friends to tonight's PSW meeting and the lecture by Eric Cline. The Society is very grateful to PSW full year series sponsors, PSW member Mike Helton and Helton Associates. Thank you, Mike. And to the sponsor of tonight's lecture, PSW member Ed Gaddisoo. Thank you, Ed. I am pleased to report once again that the 2-for-1 donor matching donation has been fully funded. That's a total of $30,000 for PSW, which is a big help in helping us operate in the black this year. And we're very grateful to the donor who made this gift possible and to all of those who responded so enthusiastically. And please join me in applauding their contributions. So I'm pleased to announce that the following new members have been admitted to the Society. Ellie Wonder, a naval architect with the United States Coast Guard interested in nuclear power, maritime technology and space, who learned of PSW from Meetup. Linda Voss, CEO at Inklings LLC, and science writer for NASA, interested in linguistics, planetary and space science, regenerative farming and forestry, who learned of PSW from PSW member Christian Ferry. Hugh Brooks, cybersecurity and technology professional with Ledger Ops, broadly interested in science and technology, who learned of PSW from a friend. Lillian Solonic, assistant managing editor at the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences, which we all fondly know as PNAS, interested in physics, cosmology, and space exploration, neuroscience, and archaeology, who learned of PSW from looking for cool lectures in DC on the web. James Cole, senior scientist at Leidos, interested in optics and photonics, quantum computing, and applied mathematics, who learned of PSW from a colleague. Maddie Erkin, chemistry teacher and businesswoman interested in science education, psychology, and psychiatry, and in clinical trials, standards, and management, who learned of PSW from Eventbrite. And tonight's speaker, who actually already is a member, a speaker member, by virtue of his having spoken at the 2,351st meeting on October 9th, 2015. And for those of you who are interested, that talk is kind of a prelude to tonight's talk. Please join me all in welcoming them to the Society. All new members are entitled to a signed copy of Volume 1 of the Bulletin of the Philosophical Society of Washington, and if you have not gotten yours, please see me after the lecture, and I'd be glad to provide your copy to you. Recording Secretary Scott Matthews will now present the minutes of the 2,490th meeting and the lecture by Bartek Rajwa on using biophysics to detect food fraud.
Good evening, everyone. On February 9th, 2024, in the Powell Auditorium of the Cosmos Club in Washington, D.C., President Larry Milstein called the 2,490th meeting of the Society to order at 8:04 p.m. He began by welcoming attendees, thanking sponsors for their support, and announcing new members. Scott Matthews then read the minutes of the previous meeting, including the lectures by Lloyd Mitchell, A.J. Kothari, and Scott Matthews. The minutes were approved as read. President Milstein then introduced the speaker for the evening, Bartek Rajwa of Purdue University. His lecture was entitled Spectroscopy of Deception, Unmasking Food Fraud with Biophysics. The speaker began by comparing the USDA and FDA definition of food fraud with those of the European Union, indicating that, quote, food fraud is taken way more seriously in Europe. He stated a useful definition as fraudulent intentional substitution or addition of a substance in a product for the purpose of increasing the apparent value of the product or reducing the cost of its production, i.e. for economic gain. He listed the commonly adulterated food products as oils, milk, juices, spices, sweeteners, seafood, and grains and cereal. Rajwa then recounted a recent scandal in the United States where a large quantity of ground, quote, Parmesan cheese was found to comprise primarily old cheddar cheese, old, not aged, and wood pulp. He then discussed the 2013 horse meat scandal in the UK, where large quantities of ground beef were contaminated with horse meat. Rajwa detailed the circuitous route the adulterated meat had taken, starting in Poland, shipped to the Netherlands and Spain for processing, then shipped to Ireland, where it was ultimately sold to UK retailers. In the end, however, the source of the horse meat turned out to be Canada. The speaker used this example to highlight the way that global trade can make it difficult to identify the source of food fraud. Rajwa then made the distinction between intentional adulteration and unintentional or accidental adulteration, and the way such adulteration impacts food fraud, food quality, and food safety. He said that in the US, the cost of food fraud is estimated at between $10 and $15 billion annually, and in the UK, the cost is estimated between 8 and 12 billion euros. The speaker then introduced optical and spectroscopic techniques that can be used to identify food fraud, including laser-induced breakdown spectroscopy, or LIBS, and vibrational and fluorescence spectroscopy, or Raman, both of which can easily be miniaturized. In LIBS, a very powerful laser is used to heat a small volume of matter, which becomes a plasma and emits light characteristics of the atoms in the plasma plume. The light is collected by a fiber optic cable and analyzed with a spectrometer. In Raman spectroscopy, laser light scatters off molecules, and a small number of photons transfer energy to the molecule, resulting in a change in the photon's wavelength. Again, the scattered light is collected by a fiber optic cable and analyzed with a spectrometer. The shift in the wavelength of the photons is characteristic of specific molecular bonds and therefore indicative of the presence of specific molecules. Rajwa then compared the pros and cons of LIBS and Raman, arguing that these two techniques can be combined into a single instrument capable of creating a chemical fingerprint for complex organic mixtures. He showed LIBS and Raman spectra from a variety of food products in different forms. For solids, cheese and coffee beans; for liquid, balsamic vinegar and vanilla extract; and for powders, several ground spices. Rajwa commented on the complexity of these data and discussed various techniques for analyzing and identifying the spectra. He indicated that the most common spectral analysis technique used by his group was a simple machine learning algorithm, which included normalization, linear model feature selection, classification using regularized regression, and validation. He then presented some of the mathematical details of this analysis, showing how it could extract the most reliable peaks for each of the food products analyzed. Rajwa then showed how these techniques could be used to identify trace quantities of pesticides and how known information concerning the global use of pesticides could be used to identify the country of origin of various food products. He concluded his talk by reiterating the fact that Raman and LIBS are complementary techniques that are easily combined to form a portable handheld system for analyzing food products. He said that while the current systems have been used for laboratory demonstration, the future commercialization and deployment of such systems will serve to enhance food safety and reduce food fraud. The lecture was followed by a question and answer session. One member stated that, quote, "This is an important topic because everyone eats food," and asked whether these techniques would allow consumers to know with certainty if food labeled as organic was actually organic. Rajwa responded that terms like organic and sustainable were not very well defined and not well regulated. He said that determining whether a given product meets the criteria for being labeled as organic or sustainable would require stricter definitions of the terms. He commented on the fact that organic foods have a notoriously bad record in terms of foodborne pathogens. A member asked about the applicability of this technology to engineered food. Rajwa responded first by making the distinction between bioengineered versus engineered food products. For bioengineered foods, or genetically modified organisms, he said that genetic testing could reveal the presence of genetically modified products. For engineered foods, which he defined as either being grown in a laboratory or heavily processed, he said that these spectroscopic techniques would be ideal because it is extremely difficult to produce the natural ratios of the various compounds. A viewer of the live stream asked if local authorities were using techniques such as Raman and Libs to detect food fraud in restaurants, particularly with respect to seafood substitutions. Rajwa replied that his instruments were strictly for laboratory use and that he hoped that such systems could be used in this scenario in the future. After the question and answer period, President Milstein thanked the speaker and presented him with a PSW rosette, a signed copy of the announcement of his talk, and a signed copy of Volume 1 of the PSW Bulletin. He then announced speakers for upcoming lectures, made a number of housekeeping announcements, and invited guests to join the Society. He adjourned the 2,490th meeting of the Society at 10:04 p.m. Eastern Time. Temperature in Washington, D.C., 10.6 degrees Celsius. Weather, mostly cloudy. Attendance in the Powell Auditorium, 41. Viewers on the live stream, 30, for a total of 71 live viewers. Views of the video in the first 2 weeks, 329. Respectfully submitted, Scott Matthews, Recording Secretary.
Are there any comments on the minutes? Any corrections? If not, I'll entertain a motion by a member to accept the minutes as read. Now, a second. All members in favor? All members opposed? Hearing no opposition, the minutes are accepted unanimously as read and will be posted to the website in due course. Online viewers, if you have any comments, you can submit them electronically to the corresponding secretary, correspondingsec@pswscience.org, and they will be taken into consideration, and if necessary, the minutes will be corrected. And we now turn to tonight's lecture by Eric Cline. Eric is professor of classics, history, and anthropology, and director of the Capitol Archaeological Institute at the George Washington University. He is as well a National Geographic Explorer, NEH Public Scholar, a Getty Scholar, and a Fulbright Scholar. Previously, he served as chair of the Department of Classical and Near Eastern Languages and Civilizations at GW. He is an active field archaeologist with more than 30 seasons of excavation and survey experience throughout the Middle East, Cyprus, Greece, Crete, and the United States. He currently serves as co-director of the excavations at Tel Kabrib and Megiddo. He is an author on nearly 100 articles and more than 20 books, including 1177 BC, the year civilization collapsed, and with Glynis Fawkes, 1177 BC, and The Survival of Civilizations, about to be published. Among other honors and awards, he is the recipient of an honorary doctorate from Muhlenberg College. He earned an AB in classical anthropology, archaeology and anthropology at Dartmouth, and an MA in Near Eastern languages and literature at Yale. He studied at the American School of Classical Studies in Athens, and then went on to earn a PhD in ancient history at the University of Pennsylvania. He previously spoke at the 2351st PSW meeting on October 9th, 2015. His lecture, Sailing the Wine Dark Seas, touched on the Bronze Age collapse and is worth watching not only in its own right, but also as an enlargement of the lecture you will hear tonight. The video of this talk has been viewed over 46,000 times on YouTube. All questions will be held for the question and answer period after the lecture. And without further ado, Eric, welcome to the stage.
And thank you all for coming tonight, for coming out into the post-pandemic lecture attendance hall. So it's nice to be back. It's a pleasure and an honor. I do remember very clearly talking here 2015. This was one of the first audiences to hear my lecture about 1177 BC. And I got some very valuable feedback and a co-authored article or two out of that. And you are now tonight one of the first audiences to hear about the sequel, which will be coming out in a month after 1177, the survival of civilization. So you can think of this as a prolonged infomercial trying to get you to buy the book. But we also, coming out on that same day, April 16th, we have the graphic version of the original. So if you have a tiny tot that likes cartoons and comics, or a relative that doesn't like to read, Glynis Fox has done an amazing job in translating the original into a graphic history, and it's absolutely gorgeous. I wish I had brought my copy with me, but I'll just have to tantalize you with that. So this book, which is coming out in about a month, is the sequel to 1177 BC. And what I'm going to do tonight, with your permission, is to first introduce again what I had talked about in 1177 BC, thinking that there are a number of you tonight that haven't read the book or don't remember the lecture or need your mind refreshed, as I do more and more frequently these days. And then from there, segue into the sequel. So we will go tonight from the Bronze Age to the Iron Age, if you will stay with me. So let me take you back first to what is still my favorite period in ancient history. I say that every time I lecture, and it remains true. This is the Late Bronze Age. If I could be reincarnated backwards, I would love to live back then. I would love to meet Shuppi-Luliuma, Akhenaten, Hatshepsut, you name it. That would I'd be dead again. I'd be dead within 48 hours, but it would be a fun 48 hours. So what we've got, we're going to start back here. The Late Bronze Age starts in 1700, goes down for about 500 years. We're not going to start at 1700. We're actually going to start at the tail end with the collapse, 1200 BC. But even then, we still have what I call the G8 or the G9 of the ancient world at that time. So let me see if I can get this pointer working. There we go. So at this time, we've got Minoans and Mycenaeans on mainland Greece. I presume you've heard of Agamemnon, Helen of Troy, the Trojan War, and all that. This is that time period, if it took place, which, by the way, I think something did take place. So you've got Minoans and Mycenaeans in Greece. Over the green are the Hittites in Anatolia. That would be modern-day Turkey. Got Cyprus on Cyprus. In green, you've got the Canaanites, what is today Israel, Lebanon, Syria, Jordan, Palestinian territories. You've got Egypt, down in Egypt, obviously. And up here in Mesopotamia, basically modern-day Iraq, you've got the Assyrians and Babylonians. And all of these people are happily interacting throughout the entire Late Bronze Age. And if you think you've never heard of this, think again. You actually do know more than you think you do. So, Hatshepsut. How many have heard of Hatshepsut, the famous female pharaoh? Right, okay. Tutmosis III, her stepson and nephew, same thing. How about Amenhotep III? Lesser known, but my favorite guy. How about his son, Akhenaten, the heretic pharaoh? Right. Probably not many of you have heard of King Tut. Okay, maybe more than I thought. Ramses II. Ramses III is going to be our hero of the first couple of slides. So this is the period we're talking about. This is the Egyptian New Kingdom, the 18th dynasty. By the time we're done, we're going to get into the 19th and 20th and beyond. But this is where we're starting out. So most people, when you meet them on the street, say they would have no idea about this period. And then you start naming this, like, oh, yeah, I remember studying that back in school. So that period back then, in the late Bronze Age, is a period of international connectedness. It has been called, in this region of the world, it's been called the globalized Mediterranean, which I would agree with. So they are in contact, everything from what is today Italy on the west to Iran on the east, from Turkey in the north down to Egypt in the south, in modern terms. In ancient terms, I would say this is from the western Mediterranean to the eastern Mediterranean, including the Aegean, Anatolia, and Egypt. So as you can see on this diagram, which my wife Diane Harris Cline made, I was talking to her about all of this while I was writing 1177 BC, and she said, you know, you're describing a small world network. And I'm like, what is that? Now, in addition to being an archaeologist and ancient historian, she did social network analysis, which a number of you here today are quite familiar with. And she said, in social network analysis, if you have an interconnected group, and of the members, none of them are more than 3 hops away from each other, then you've got a small world, right? So for instance, in this particular case, the Mycenaeans are not in direct contact with the Assyrians, but the Mycenaeans are in contact with this group, and they are in contact with that group, right? So you've got 2 hops there. So anytime you have a group like this in which nobody is more than 3 hops away from everybody else, you've got a small world. You know the parlor game people used to play with Kevin Bacon and the movies he's in? Same thing, right? Okay. So why should we care about this? Because there have not been many times in human history when we have something like this. Us today, for sure. Them back then, late Bronze Age, also, which is why I have said for decades now that we have more in common with that ancient world 3,200 years ago than you might expect. Therefore, what happened to them should send chills down our spine, because, cutting to the chase, and spoiler alert, I see a lot of what happened back then around today. And they collapsed. So, but I don't want to ruin your evening, but that's where we're going, okay? So, there is a lot of trade. As I mentioned, it's a globalized Mediterranean. One of the best examples we've got is a ship that went down in about 1300 BCE off the coast of Anatolia, namely the Uluburun shipwreck, and you can see that in the top couple of slides. The map in the middle with the blue arrows is what National Geographic thought was the route that it was taken when it went down 3,300 years ago. But we've got other examples, other data points, including things like the Amarna letters, which we see here, which is an archive from Egypt that is from the time of Amenhotep III and Akhenaten. They are writing to the great kings of all the other kingdoms, as well as to the vassal rulers in Canaan. So we've got those texts. We've got other texts as well. We've also got things such as this, a wall painting from one of the tombs of the nobles in Egypt, showing Minoans and Mycenaeans bringing gifts to Egypt. So we know that all these people are in either direct or indirect contact at that time. And then I can't help but mention my absolute favorite, these sandals. There is one text from Mari from about the 18th century BC that talks about leather shoes, probably sandals, from Crete being sent to Hammurabi in Babylon. And yes, that's the Hammurabi, the law code, an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth. But the text says that Hammurabi received the shoes and sent them back. I've never known why he sent them back, right? Too small, too last millennium, and hadn't he ever heard of regifting? I mean, come on. Like, I don't like these, but they're from Crete, so, they're yours. All right, so we've got all these evidences of the interconnected world back in the late Bronze Age. So what's the problem? The problem is, right after 1200 BCE, everything came collapsing down within just a couple of decades. Right? Everything that would have been merrily and happily bubbling along for up to 500 years by this point, suddenly, 1200, 1190, 1180, 1177, everything comes crashing down. And the entire network is gone. And one of the questions that we've had is what caused it, right? And that's where writing 1177 came from. Because what I realized was, first of all, everybody in my particular field, this is common knowledge. We know this. The rest of the world does not know. It's the catastrophe that nobody's ever heard of, right? Everybody's heard of the fall of the Roman Empire, right? Most people have not heard of the fall of the late Bronze Age or the collapse. So, but the magnitude was, as my kids would say, ginormous, right? And there's about 1,500 years between the late Bronze Age collapse and the fall of the Roman Empire. It's been another 1,500 years since Rome fell. I don't want to say history repeats, but, kind of does. All right. So, all right. So this is why I wrote 1177. Rob Tempio of Princeton approached me. He says, I want you to write a book about the late Bronze Age collapse. And I said, I want to write about what collapsed. He's like, okay, begin and end the book with the collapse, and in the middle you can write about whatever you want. So the whole middle of the book, and those of you who have read this know it, the whole middle of the book is about Minoans, Mycenaeans, Hittites, and so on, and so on. Okay, so originally, and back when I was in graduate school, the Sea Peoples were blamed for this, these mysterious Sea Peoples. I think they are still part of the equation, but I don't think that they actually caused this collapse. In fact, I think they're kind of as much victims as they were oppressors. So if it's not the Sea Peoples that caused the collapse, then what did? So over the course of my undergraduate and graduate career, I was taught a gazillion different things. Maybe drought, maybe famine, maybe earthquakes, maybe invaders. And when it came time to write the book, my answer was yes. All of the above, because none of these on their own would have brought down one society, let alone 8 of them, right? We have earthquakes all the time today. Lots of people die, but the society does not go away. Same thing with drought, same thing with famine. What, though, if you have them all at about the same time or in rapid succession, one after the other? This is what I would call a perfect storm of catastrophes, all right? And then once the book came out in 2014, and I was here in 2015 lecturing on it, suddenly it was like the sluice gates opened up. Tons of data started being published every year. More and more data, scientific data, pollen analysis, stalagmites, lake sediments, and each and every one of them was confirming what I said. Yay, this was good. All right, but there was so much data that I asked the publisher if I could come up with a revised edition. So those of you that have the original, I updated it a bit. Came out in 2021 during the pandemic. Most people missed it. But I would still be aligned with this, that it was a perfect storm. As my kids used to say, it was a, what is it Lemony Snicket said, a series of unfortunate events. All right, that's pretty much what it was. Okay, now, what I'm going to do just for a second is run through the data that we've got in order to bring you all onto the same page and up to speed so that when I segue into the new research, you will understand where I am coming from. So one slide just to show you about drought and all the data that we've got. This is a fairly new map that Kanievsky put out in 2019. Every one of the little red dots that you see on this map represents another site with another series of scientific expeditions, experiments, whatever, that have shown evidence for drought back at that time. The drought may have lasted up to 300 years in some places. Not continuous, but pretty continuous. Think of the drought that's hitting California and the West Coast now and multiply that. So what to me is amazing is that these dots stretch from Italy to Iran, and every one of them is showing that that particular place was impacted by drought at that time. So the evidence just keeps growing. It definitely looks like there was climate change around about 1200 BC. And indeed, we have textual evidence for this as well. And what I like about these studies is every time you've got some scientific data, you can usually corroborate it with written textual data. So in this particular case, here is a letter that was found at Ugarit. Ugarit was a port city on the coast of what is today North Syria. French have been excavating there since, well, at least 50 years, if not more now. And I show you this in part because this is one of the new letters that came out that got me to write the revised version, because this text was only published in 2016. My book had come out in 2014. This was published in French in 2016, and then in English by Yuri Cohen in 2020. And it is a letter from Merneptah, the pharaoh of Egypt, to the king of Ugarit. What's interesting is that the pharaoh is quoting an earlier letter that the king had sent to him. So you have a quoted letter here. "You had written to me," says the Egyptian pharaoh, "in the land of Ugarit there is a severe hunger. May my Lord save the land of Ugarit. May my Lord give grain to save my life." This is kind of a smoking gun. We now know that there is famine in Ugarit, most likely caused by the drought. And we've got other evidence too. It's not just Ugarit, it's Anatolia, and it's other places as well. So for instance, and this is not the tablet, this is a placeholder tablet, but never mind. We have a number of letters from the Hittite king sent down to the Egyptian pharaoh, and one from a Hittite queen as well, in which they say things like, "Don't you know there's a famine in my lands? With me here, plenty has become famine, and it's a matter of life and death." So we've got both scientific and textual data for the drought and the famine. Similarly, we have mostly textual, but also some archaeological evidence for invaders. And this is where, for instance, the Sea Peoples come in, because we know from the records in Egypt that they invade twice, these mysterious Sea Peoples. They come in 1207 and they come in 1177, and that's where the title of the first book came from. And here I'm showing you from Medinet Habu, the mortuary temple of Ramses III, the picture that he drew on the wall, and then the inscription talking about the foreign countries making a conspiracy in their islands. And he actually tells us which way they go, tells us basically they come across Greece and Turkey in modern terms, Cyprus, North Syria, and then they come down into Egypt. But the Egyptians beat these Sea Peoples both times, 1207, 1177, and they never come back again. They still remain a mystery, though. We've never found a site that we can point to where we can say that's where the Sea Peoples come from. So Ramses III, though, does give us some of the names. So, for instance, let me see if I can get the pointer working there. He says the confederation was the Peleset, the Tejeker, the Shekelesh, the Denyen, and the Weshesh. So we've been playing linguistic games for about a century now. Shekelesh could be Sicily. The Denyen might be Homer's Danaans, the people fighting in the Trojan War, and so on. The only ones that we think we maybe know are the Shardana, which might come from Sardinia, and these Shekelesh that might come from Sicily. But the big one, the Peleset. The Peleset become the Philistines. Right? We know them from the Bible and everywhere else. So this is our name for them, the Sea Peoples. Was actually coined by some of the early French Egyptologists. Egyptians do not call them the Sea Peoples, they call them by these names. So, as I said, I think that these people are part of this, but they're not the reason for the destruction. I think they're actually migrating because of the drought and famine in their lands. So, most people today think the Sea Peoples are coming from the Western Mediterranean and settling in the Eastern Mediterranean. They left the Western Mediterranean because of a drought there, in which case the joke was on them because the drought was also in the Eastern Mediterranean, but they didn't have the information to know that, but never mind. So we still have to find more of the Sea Peoples, but we definitely have them textually. And now, again, some of the new data. Sorry. Again, one of these letters that was published in French in 2016 and that Yuri Cohen published in English in 2020. It's a letter from the very last king of Ugarit to the Hittite viceroy ruling at Carchemish. And he says, "To the king, my lord, thus Hammurabi, or Amurapi, your servant, I wrote to you 2 times, 3 times. News regarding the enemy." And unfortunately, he never gives us the name of the enemy. He just says, "the enemy. May my lord know that now the enemy forces are stationed at Rashu, which is the port city for Ugarit, modern Ras Ibn Hani." And he says, "Their avant-garde forces are on their way to Ugarit. Please send help." We know the help didn't come in time. Ugarit was burnt to the ground, and we know it was done by humans. There's a meter of destruction. There are arrowheads in the walls. There are hordes buried under the floor of people that thought they would come back, and they never did. City of Ugarit is abandoned for at least 400 years after this point. So we know from the texts that there are invaders, we just don't know their names, and we know from the archaeology that they succeeded in destroying Ugarit. So now we've got more evidence for invaders. Even more evidence for earthquakes also. I had suggested this in the original as part and parcel of the perfect storm. We've got earthquake evidence at sites like Mycenae, which you see top and bottom on the left. Sites like Troy. Troy 6 is destroyed by an earthquake. That wall is not supposed to be tilting that way. If anybody here is from California, you know what I'm talking about. And even Ugarit itself is in the bottom right hand in black and white. This is a wall that was tossed about by an earthquake a little bit earlier, about 1365 BC. But so this whole area is hit by a series of earthquakes over a period of about 50 years. So some of the destruction of the sites is by humans, some of it is courtesy of Mother Nature. And there's, in fact, even more evidence now for earthquakes at other sites, like Azekah in Israel and over in Jordan. The other thing that we've got, which is kind of hard to find, is disease, right? In order to make sure that we would have disease, we'd either have to have texts or we'd have to have like a mass grave where we could test the bones and see if there's malaria or bubonic plague or something like that. So far, we don't have those mass graves, but we do have a couple of things that will almost do in the interim. For one, we have the mummy of Ramses V. You see him here, and if you can look really closely, you can see that he obviously had smallpox and probably died from it. You can still see the pustules on his skin. And in fact, we have also a text. It's one of the Turin papyri, and in it, it talks about the death of Ramses V and other members of his family. And they say that they had to dig new tombs for them, that they didn't bury them for something like 16 months, and that they gave the workmen who dug the tombs and buried the pharaoh, they gave them a month's leave at full pay afterward, and they closed the Valley of the Kings. It was a quarantine. All right, so we've definitely got disease back then as well. And again, most of this is new. Hard to prove, but think of, let's see, the Iliad, Book 1, when the Mycenaeans are attacking Troy. The forces get ravaged by a plague. Think of Passover. Think of the Exodus. You've got the 10 plagues. These may be memories of plagues from that time. So I think disease is part of that as well. Now, if you add them all up, in this collapse at about 1200, and this was the conclusion that I came to at the end of the first book, we're looking at a systems collapse. This is what happens when just everything goes kablooey. Your central administration collapses, centralized economy collapses. The traditional elite, the 1%, they go away. And you get a lot of death, population decline, and a lot of migration, a lot of people moving around. And that's what we've got here. Now, the important thing about a systems collapse, it takes up to 100 years. It takes up to about a century. And that's what we've got here. So the title 1177, if you've read the book, you know that I argue throughout the book that the title is not accurate. 1177 is not the year civilization collapsed. It is just a benchmark. All right, when we teach our kids in 6th grade or 10th grade about the Roman Empire, and we say it fell in 476 AD, we know it didn't, right? It took most of the 5th century, and even after that, the Eastern Roman Empire kept going for another 1,000 years. Still, 476 is shorthand for the end of the Roman Empire. 1177 for me is shorthand for the collapse, even though it took an entire century. And in fact, at one point, Rob said to me, okay, Smarty Pants, if you don't like 1177 as the title, what would you call it? And I said, well, life in 1200 BC was very different from 1100 BC and totally different from 1000 BC. And he said, well, that may be accurate, but it won't fit on a book cover, which was quite true. He's like, trust me, numbers sell. I'm like, okay, fine. So 1177 it was. But bear in mind, it took over a century for this to happen. And the other thing that I tried to pull in, and I was candid about it in the book, I wasn't sure if this was something worth using or not. I pulled in complexity theory, and a number of you here deal with complexity theory. Basically, as a system gets more complex, it becomes more and more easy for it to break apart, right? If anything goes wrong, you're dead meat. And this becomes what is known as hypercoherence. So I made the analogy that if you've got a really expensive race car and you've got one thrown rod that goes through your engine, you now have a very expensive piece of junk. All right, and that's basically what they had back then because parts of the system fell apart and broke down. So the thing that we are interested in, and again, I said I don't know if complexity theory is just a new way of saying an old thing, but what I liked about it is that when you get a complex system that breaks down, it usually breaks down into smaller component parts. And that's exactly what we see at the end of the late Bronze Age. The big kind of kingdoms and empires, they go away. We'll look at them in just a minute. And they are replaced by much smaller city-states and kingdoms. So we really do have a complex system going down to a lower level of socio-political complexity, which Colin Renfrew, he's the one that started us down this road about systems collapse and archaeology in the late 70s. He said that a systems collapse is frequently followed by a dark age. And in a dark age, you get this lower level of socio-political complexity and everything else, including looking back at the golden age that has just disappeared. And you can look at Homer talking about the Trojan War as a great example of that. So as a result, we've come to know the period after the collapse as the world's first dark age. One of the things that I argue in the new book, and which I will mention here tonight, is I don't think it's a dark age. It's an age of innovation. It's an age of inventiveness because they had to. All right, but I'll come back to that in just a second. Basically, the world I've just described, the world of the late Bronze Age, goes away. Everything changes. Everything transforms. And there's a big discussion within archaeology. A number of people are saying, yeah, it's a collapse, which is what I argue. And there are a number of other people saying it's not a collapse. It's a transformation. And I'm like, what's the difference? And they're like, well, actually, they're related. They're two sides of the same coin. And so in the sequel, what I'm going to argue, I'm slithering under it, it's both a collapse and a transformation. What collapses is the generalized network that was linking them all together. That, without argument, is gone for right now. It's going to take up to 400 years to build that connectiveness back up, that globalization. The transformation takes part in the individual societies, the G8s, Mycenaeans, Minoans, Hittites, and they each do better or worse according to, well, we'll see in just a moment. But what happens is everything changes to these smaller kingdoms and the smaller polities in the Iron Age. Now, that's where this book comes from. And I have to tell you that in writing it, which was absolutely fascinating, there's been so much new work done on this period, which is the 400 years after the collapse. Basically, it goes from 1177 to 776. Some of you may be familiar with what happened in 776 BC. It's the year of the first Olympiad in Greece, according to tradition. So I took it down to basically the early 8th century. I originally wrote it by century, just like 1177. So it was 12th century, 11th century, 10th century, 9th century. And I found I found very quickly that I was getting whiplash between the different societies. And so I said to my editor, I've got to change this. And we've been now doing it by geography. So that's what the chapters are, it's geographical. So chapter 1 is Egypt and southern Levant. And chapter 2 is Assyrians and Babylonians. Chapter 3, Cypriots, Phoenicians, so on. Because what it turned out is I realized we have 8 case studies of what to do and what not to do in case your world collapses. Some of these were successful, some of them were not. And what I want to do is walk you through these and see if there are any lessons for us. Not just from the collapse, but from coming out of the collapse. We're talking resilience here, transformation, adaptation, coping. What did they do that was right and wrong? And is there anything that we can take away from this? So basically, I'm asking, how did we get from the left-hand picture to the right-hand picture? How did we get from the Late Bronze Age to the Iron Age? Now, as I just mentioned, some people, like me, call it a collapse. Others say it's a transformation. Still others say it's both. And what I would say, and I would compare it here, you're looking at the swimming pool in the so-called Pink Palace, where the Getty scholars are housed. It's kind of interesting. You're swimming in the pool, and everybody in all the apartments can watch you. So, yeah. So a lot of people went swimming at like 6 a.m. Right. Anyway, if you are looking at the chairs in the back from the distance, it's very clear. If you get up very close, though, it gets completely pixelated. And that's the case with the Late Bronze Age and the Iron Age. From far away, we can pretty much see what happens. When we get right up close, we can start seeing the differences and what's going on there. And I would actually say that I like the comparison to an Impressionist painting. From far away, you know exactly what this is. But the closer you get, the more you just see the individual dabs of paint. So what I am trying to warn the people that are reading the book is, get close enough so you can study it, but not that close that you miss the overall big picture, okay? So, all right. And the reason I say that is because the aftermath of the catastrophe, the aftermath of the collapse is messy. You thought the collapse was messy? Wait till you see what happens afterward. Everybody comes back in a different way or not at all. All right, the Cypriots and the Phoenicians, they do the best. Assyrians and Babylonians, not bad. The Egyptians, meh, I give them a passing grade. Gentlemen C. All right, Hittites, not good at all. All right, so everybody comes back in a different way and with different levels of success. One of the analogies that I was thinking as I was writing it is it's like a foot race. Everybody starts at the starting line at the same time, the collapse in 1200 BC. How long it takes you to get to the finish line and whether you even make it to the finish line differs on who you are. Everybody who survives is across the finish line by the 8th century. Some went over it in just a couple of decades. Others, like the Greeks, took 400 years. So I kind of make the analogy to a foot race. Now, over the last couple of decades in archaeology and in the general public, there's been a lot of interest in the collapse of society. For us in the field, books like Joseph Tainter's The Collapse of Complex Societies and others like that, 1988, spurred our interest. For others, it was Jared Diamond writing his book Collapse that got people interested. The one thing that I would say is a bit different about our period is that most of these books were talking about one society that collapsed, the Maya, Harappa, the Romans, something like that. We're talking about 8 societies that all collapsed at once. But still, there's been a lot of interest in the collapse, and even more now in what happens after collapse. So now we're getting mostly edited volumes from conferences after collapse, the regeneration of complex societies, beyond collapse, and all of that. And this is where they're verging into other fields that are dealing especially with things like resilience, right? And again, this is a buzzword that's getting more and more common every day. In fact, some of my colleagues accuse me of jumping on the bandwagon. You're just doing resilience because everybody's doing it. I'm like, no, I'm doing it because there was resilience after the collapse. That's the way it is. Right. But so I found myself, while working on this book, reading in a lot of other fields and seeing what they were doing with the concept of resilience and how they were applying it. And one of the surprises that I found is that we actually have a semi-official definition, which the Department of Homeland Security requested and the National Research Council came up with in 2011. Definition of resilience: the ability to, quote, continue to operate under stress, adapt to adversity, and recover functionality after a crisis, end quote. Not surprised that we're a little interested in resilience today, right? Yeah, we're trying to kind of do the same sort of thing. So the other thing that I ran across, which I thought was applicable to all of this, is the adaptive cycle, which is used in resilience theory. And in particular, I thought that it was interesting because down here, where we get the release phase, or the omega phase, that would be the collapse. But the release phase is almost immediately followed by a reorganization phase, or the alpha phase. And I thought to myself, that's the Bronze Age and the collapse, and that's the Iron Age. And so I think we can talk about everything here in terms of resilience theory and the adaptive cycle. All right, but then again, as my kids reminded me, that's like just the natural order of things. I don't know about you, but at one point we watched Hamilton something like every night in a row when it came on the Disney Channel for like 25 straight nights, right? And so we would all hum along, and we said there's a line from Hamilton for every situation. And so I was talking at the dinner table one night about this, and my daughter just looked at me and went, "Oceans rise, empires fall." I'm like, oh my God, yeah. So that's the question is, okay, fine. So this is part of the adaptive cycle. Hasn't that happened with every society, every civilization? The answer is yes, pretty much. Almost every society that has been around in human history has collapsed or has at least transformed so it's been kind of unrecognizable in its next iteration. But I think this is still useful to take a look and think of this in terms of the omega cycle, the omega phase and the alpha phase, the release and then the reorganization. And the other thing that I think we can pull into play, though I am quite aware that we might be putting our stuff back on them, and that might not be totally fair, but I found what the IPCC has been doing to be very, very useful. Right, you all know the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. They won the Nobel Peace Prize back in 2007, and pretty much every year they come out with one of these reports that basically says we're all going to die, right, sooner rather than later, right? So in 2012, they came out with this report, Managing the Risks of Extreme Events and Disasters to Advance Climate Change Adaptation. Now, usually they're more concerned with things like Hurricane Katrina and modern day things. And in fact, they very, very rarely cite archaeologists, I think. And I told one of the guys that I met, I said, you need to use archaeology more. We've got a lot of examples from the ancient world that would help you out here. Anyway, so from this 2012, I realized that they had a bunch of definitions that would match what we're doing. So for instance, they define an extreme impact event, and the late Bronze Age collapse absolutely qualifies as an extreme impact event, one that affects societies and so on and so forth. So I thought that would be useful. But what was even more useful is that they then took that, the extreme impacts and the definition, and went from there to disasters, and went from there to capacity to recover. And each of those, I think, really works if we're trying to actually describe what happened after the collapse and into the Iron Age. And in particular, what I liked were their definitions of coping, adapting, and transforming. Because they said, coping, you're just focusing on the moment. You're just trying to survive, right? Constraint and survival. Adapting is one stage up higher, where you're focusing a bit more on the future, right? You're learning, you're reinventing, and so on. Transforming, is pretty much the highest you can get. Sustainability resilience involves both social innovations and technological innovations. And I thought every one of my 8 societies can fit into one of these. Some transformed, some just adapted, and some barely coped. So I thought that was also useful. And in one of the tables in the book, I actually took all of the terms, gave them their definitions, gave them the source also, so I wouldn't plagiarize them, and then said, so what can we do with this? And so what I do, and this is where, frankly, I'm expecting the most pushback, not just from the general public, but from my colleagues especially. The first 5 chapters of this sequel are a history book. History with archaeology. I go through the history of each of the areas. This is what happened in the next 4 centuries. The last chapter is where I do the analyses, and this is where I plug in the adaptive cycle, the IPCC definitions, and I had the temerity to also rank the societies as to how well they did in coming out after the collapse. And I think, I already know, some of my colleagues are not going to be happy because their favorite society is ranked lower than they think it should be, right? Others will be, ooh, I'm higher than I thought. But so we'll see. So I will be especially interested in what you all think here. And I have to admit that at the beginning it was a gut reaction that I had written all this and I thought, I'm like, oh yeah, Phoenicians and Cypriots are way up top and Hittites are down bottom. And somebody at one point said, well, show me some numbers. I'm like, no, it's a gut feeling. They're like, no, show me some numbers. I'm like, all right, I'll show you some numbers. And so I created a table like this where we've got, let's see, maintains economy, maintains administration, maintains trade, et cetera, and then Hittites, Mycenaeans, Minoans, and so on. And I said, you get 2 points if you maintain it full. You get 1 if you maintain it partially. You get 0 if you don't do it at all. And so from this, I managed to create a table that I was happy with that actually reflected what I already thought, which I know is not what's supposed to do, but never mind. So when I got to the end, I was able to get the numbers. I massaged the numbers so that the people I thought should be at the top were at the top, and the people at the bottom were at the bottom. And now if anybody says, show me numbers, I'm like, here you go. Right, but you guys know what actually happened. So, all right. So what we've got, I then took them and I put them into categories. So category 1 are the people that did the best, that they're even more than simply resilient. They're maybe even anti-fragile, right? Some of you know this term already. Nassim Nicholas Taleb has a book called Anti-Fragile. It's when you flourish in the age of chaos. You take advantage of it. And I think that our central Canaanites, who never really collapsed, they're in the area of Lebanon today, they become the Phoenicians. There's almost a straight transition right there, just the name changes. And even they didn't call themselves Phoenicians. I'll get into this in a moment, but that's what the later Greeks called them. They do well. They're up in the top category. Same with the people on Cyprus. They also do well. Category number 2, they're ones that are very resilient, and they're busy adapting and maybe even transforming. And that's where we get our Assyrians and Babylonians, but also the Neo-Hittites and the northern Canaanites, the ones that are up in North Syria in terms of today. And this is remnants of the Hittite Empire that managed to survive. Number 3, those are the Egyptians who, they kind of survived. They didn't do great. They were resilient, but just barely. More coping, but not really adapting. 4, my favorites, the Mycenaeans and Minoans. I'm sorry, I love them to death, but they're in category 4. Right? They are not resilient very much. They actually almost completely collapse and have to build right from the ground up again. So I put them in category 4. Category 5, the ones that are not resilient, and they either completely vanish or are assimilated into other societies. And these, I think, are the Hittites, without doubt, that were in Anatolia. They're completely gone, as I'll show you in just a moment. The big pushback is going to be southern Canaanites, because a lot of my colleagues are going to want them to be up higher. But think in the region where Kingdom of Israel, Kingdom of Judah, Ammonites, Moabites, Edomites, that region is where the Canaanites were. And I think they got assimilated. But again, I will show you this in just a moment, because with your permission, let me walk you through just briefly each of these. So category 1 this extremely resilient, perhaps even anti-fragile, Phoenicians and Cypriots. Phoenicians are known for the standardization of the alphabet and then spreading it out into the Mediterranean. They basically take over the role that Ugarit had in the Late Bronze Age. They take over all the shipping, and they spread absolutely everything. And in addition to the alphabet, of course, they spread purple dye. That becomes the main thing they are known for. The Cypriots, on the other hand, are known for iron. So here's Nassim Nicholas Taleb in his book, Anti-Fragile. He actually is of Lebanese descent, so he says he's related to the ancient Phoenicians, which is fine, which is good. So he's like very proud that they're in category number 1. Right. All right. So, as I say, they spread the alphabet. They do not invent the alphabet. The alphabet's already around. What they do is standardize it, and then they bring it over to Greece and even over to Italy. So it becomes the Greek alphabet and the Latin alphabet. Now, we all today are still using the Latin alphabet, obviously, because you use it to write English, French, German, Italian, all the Romance languages. And even some of the other written scripts come from this as well. So I thought they should be up in number 1. They definitely transformed. And we actually have inscriptions from Byblos and from Tyre. As you can see here, we know the names of a number of the kings, in part because they are written, for example, on our sarcophagus. They are written on an Egyptian statue that was sent as a gift, where we know the Egyptian name because the cartouche is on there, but the Phoenician king has added his own inscription. So here we've got direct continuity. We've got dynasties going down through here in the Phoenicians. So I see continuity there. I see also transformation. So is this the alpha phase with innovation and inventiveness from the adaptive cycle, or is it anti-fragile? I would argue it's both. So I put them in category 1. Similarly with Cyprus. Now, Cyprus in the Late Bronze Age had been the source for copper. And it still retained that to a certain extent, right? You got Kypros, the actual name of the island. They seem to have been the ones that transformed over to using iron. Now, remember, when you make bronze, and I don't know how many of you make it on a daily basis in your backyard or wherever, but when you make bronze, you need 90% copper and 10% tin. All right, the copper is coming from Cyprus, end of story. The tin, a couple of different places, mostly though Afghanistan, the Badakhshan region. Right, some from southeastern Anatolia, maybe some from Cornwall, but mostly from Afghanistan. So if the trade routes were cut at the end of the Late Bronze Age and you can't get your tin anymore, you're in trouble, right? So what do? You start inventing things, right? So in modern terms, what if there are supply chain issues and you can't get your tin? Well, and back then, and in the first book I said the equivalent of tin back then for us would be like oil, petroleum, right? That's how important it was. Since then, I would change it, and based on what just happened during the pandemic and supply chain, I would say the importance of tin is equivalent to not toilet paper, but close. More like rare earth elements, right? All the stuff used in microchips and all of that, that would be the equivalent. So what happens if we can't get, we saw what happened in the pandemic. You couldn't get computers, you couldn't get cars, right? So what do you do when you invent? In this particular case, this is what they did. The Cypriots turned from copper to iron. They had already been running across iron while smelting copper. It's two very different processes to make bronze and iron, but still, the thinking today is that the earliest ironsmiths were on Crete. And so that is where, again, I would say you've got release and reorganization. And that is because it's driven by scarcity in this particular case. So on Cyprus, we know, for instance, they're making these, I know this is a bad picture, but they're making what we call bimetallic knives and other weapons. The actual blade is made of iron. The hilt, which would have been inlaid like with wood or ivory, the hilt has rivets holding it together that are made of bronze. So 2 different metals. It's bimetallic. We find these everywhere in the early Iron Age from like the 11th century on. They're found in Greece. They're found in the southern Levant. They're found earliest on Cyprus, and it looks like the Cypriots are making them and exporting them. But they're doing more than exporting the tools and the weapons. They're also exporting the technology and the know-how, such that it spreads very quickly. And of course, iron ore is in every country in that region, and we can actually watch the regions develop their iron metallurgy over these centuries. So I would put the Cypriots up in that top category also because of their innovations, their inventiveness. Category 2, and I'll keep you an eye on the time, so I will not go through all these. If you're really interested, you can get the book when it comes out. Category 2, Assyrians and Babylonians. They're resilient, not necessarily anti-fragile, and also these Neo-Hittites and Neo-Canaanites who adapted. And what I did also, since I wasn't content with just saying overall category 2, I'm like, let me break it down by century. Remember, the book had originally been written by century, 12th, 11th, 10th, 9th, and so I kind of mapped how they did. So, and I know the graph down bottom is not a good graph, I know that, but visually it shows you that they went down, flatlined, and then came back up. Because the Assyrians and Babylonians did quite well at first. They were not affected by the collapse, not to the extent of the other people. But then in the 11th century, they're hit late, and they get drought and famine. We know this from the text, such that they are even practicing cannibalism at one point. Now, we have tons of records from the Neo-Assyrians. Part of the problem is we don't know if we can believe them or not. They tended to exaggerate. But, you know, who among us doesn't, right? So especially the Egyptians and such. So you can see how they came on through here. But we also have, as I mentioned, all of these texts in various media, some on stone, like on right, some in ceramic, like on left. And again, we know the entire dynasty or subsequent successive dynasties such that we can reconstruct who is ruling when right down there. And it's constant. It never stops. Right? And they actually leave us records of everything they've done, because basically if you or anybody else living in the ancient Near East at this time, you did not like the Neo-Assyrians. They would come and kill you and then leave. Right? So we have, for instance, on the black obelisk on the left here of Shalmaneser III, and showing Jehu, the king of the northern kingdom of Israel, bowing down, as you can see on the right there. So they leave us all kinds of inscriptions, even on the famous, absolutely amazing, the Balawat gates, where they have bronze strips with these scenes. Shalmaneser III, here he is at Tyre, showing him conquering the Phoenician cities at that time. So we got lots of information, probably too much information. And the problem is we have the information for the 1%. We have it for the elites. We don't have it for the 99 people because they're not recorded. That we need archaeology, and we don't have enough of that yet. All right, category 3, I've already mentioned the Egyptians. Able to cope and continue on, but they didn't make the transition properly. And I say this in part because at one point during these centuries, there were not 1, not 2, not 3, but 4 different people all claiming that they were pharaoh at the same time in different parts of Egypt. Right? So that to me is not a functioning government. Right? So, but at the same time, they didn't completely fall. What they did was lose their place in the international trade and relations. They kind of withdraw for a while. They do come back from time to time. Life is not totally terrible if you were them, especially if you were one of the people named Ramses, and there were 11 of them. Right? But so we go all the way down into what's called the Third Intermediate Period, which is known as a period of anarchy. But again, notice we know all the kings and their reigns. There is some dispute in the 21st and 22nd dynasty, but never mind. For our purposes, it's okay. It's not to say that everything was terrible. That's why they're in category 3 rather than 5. So we get, for instance, this guy who's known as the Silver Pharaoh, Pusenes the First. He is in the 21st dynasty. His tomb was found. It's like the second richest tomb in all of Egypt. If King Tut had not been found, this guy would have been the wealthiest tomb in all of Egypt. But it was discovered in like 1939, just before World War II. So it didn't get any press. But nowadays, if you take a look at it, if you go to the Cairo Museum, it was on grand display. So there are some periods where they're doing well. And in fact, another example would be Pharaoh Sheshonq, who founded the 22nd dynasty. He's a Libyan, and comes up and conquers the region of Israel and Judah, leaves us a record down in Egypt of him doing that. And at the site of Megiddo, where I dug for 20 years, we actually have a big piece of stone with his cartouche on it that is probably from an inscription that he set up. So this may be Pharaoh Shishak of the Bible. Big discussion about that. So Egypt, not horrible, but not great. All right, now, category 4, though, Mycenaeans and Minoans. They're not resilient, but they do not disappear altogether. There are, I would say, it's as if you have a permeable membrane, and some of the stuff gets through, most of it's blocked. So we know, for instance, from the Linear B text in Greece, that they're already worshiping the gods and goddesses that we know of, Hera and Zeus and Poseidon and all that. And those continue in the Iron Age. We even know that some of the terms they're using, like basileus, continue on through. But it changes a bit, because back in the late Bronze Age, the big king was the Wanax, and the basileus was a much lower administrative person. In the Iron Age, Wanax goes away. You don't have anybody called a Wanax. Now the biggest guy in the area is the basileus. So there are some changes and transformations. All right, but overall, they don't do that well. You can see from this graph that they go straight on down, and then they have to build back up. But on the bright side, they're going to do well, because when they start building back up, they get, little things like democracy and the Parthenon and things like that. So they come way back, screeching back. But it takes them a while. As I say, they are the last group to get back on track. But in the meantime, we still have good things from the Iron Age in Greece, like this one huge building on top of a burial where we've got the warrior cremated and a woman next to him with a knife. She's probably been, along with the horses, accompanying the dead warrior. But there's no text. We don't actually know. It's just us reading into it. But still, there is life in Greece, or there was. And even this is where writing comes in. We know two things. We know, for instance, that Linear B has gone away. That was the writing system for the Mycenaeans. Accounting system in the palace. Once the palaces go down, you don't need the accounting anymore. Plus, there were probably only a limited number of scribes. They're now all dead, or they've migrated. So Linear B goes out of use by 1100 at the latest, maybe even earlier. But we also know, on the other hand, that they're writing stuff down 8th century into the 7th century. We get Hesiod, get Homer, get Sappho, get the early Greek poets and all that. And courtesy of the Phoenicians, they're writing it in the new alphabet. So at what point, the question we ask is, at what point between, say, 1200 and 800 does this new writing system come in? Most scholars have been arguing that it's adopted in Greece by about 800. The new push is to say, no, 300 years earlier, that the alphabet may have come as early as 1100. And I kind of like that idea, because if you look at the different inscriptions in Greece during the so-called Dark Ages, at one point there are 33 variants of the alphabet, each slightly different from the other, before they finally settle by about 800 on the one that everybody is using. So it takes you quite a while to go through 33 variants. And if we go back back to about 1100, by that point, we've got Phoenicians coming to Greece, no problem. And I think with the goods, they're bringing the alphabet, and they're bringing all the ideas. Sorry about that. That's it's my alarm. Don't you all have Indiana Jones as your alarm? No? All right, so I know I've got about 10 minutes left, so I'll start wrapping up. But anyway, where was I? Okay, so I think they were writing by about 1100, and one of the reasons, not only are the Phoenicians coming over at that point, but that's when everybody in the Near East is starting to write like this. I've never understood why you would have people in the Near East writing with the alphabet by 1100, and the Greeks, who are not that far away, it takes them 300 years. This way, everyone's doing it at the same time. I think it makes much more sense. But this is like the newest thinking in the last 2-3 years. We'll see if it takes hold. But I liked it. So this helps then the Mycenaeans come back. Minoans on Crete, also the same thing. They have to go back to basics, but they're actually doing a little bit better than we used to think. A friend of mine has called this a positive collapse. I don't quite know how a collapse is positive, but she's like, if you're going to collapse, at least do it well, right? And that's what the Minoans are doing in this particular case. All right, so what I actually asked Glynis Fox, the one who just did the graphic history or graphic version of the original book, I said, can you put the adaptive cycle in so that we can see Greece in there? And so that's what she did for me here. Early Late Bronze Age, late Bronze Age. There's the collapse in the Omega, and there is the Iron Age in the Alpha. And so I just wanted to be able to document what I think. All right, and then the last one, and I'll try not to spend too much time here, the ones that really didn't do well, the ones that I would hold up as examples of what not to do, are the Hittites and the Canaanites in southern Levant. Hittites, as you can see, start out okay and go down and just flatline, right? 11th century, 10th, 9th, Hittites gone. Period. Now, those are the Hittites in central Anatolia. And when I'm talking about the Hittites being gone, I mean the administration. I mean the king. I mean all that. The actual people living out in the towns and villages, a lot of them died, yes, but a lot of them survived, shrugged their shoulders, and kept plowing the field. Like, I wonder who I'm going to pay taxes to tomorrow. All right, so it doesn't mean that everybody went away, but it means that the Hittites as a society go away. Nobody calls themselves a Hittite after this, unless you're living in North Syria, and then you are a new Hittite or a Neo-Hittite. So we've got new data here as well. Back last March or so, they found at the Gordian, the wood in the tomb was able to show that there was a drought right about the time of our collapse. And so I thought, this is good. So we've got new stuff there, but even there, the archaeology is important because the people digging at Hattusas, the capital city of the Hittites, turns out that the king had already left. They had already moved their entire capital before the end came. When the city was burnt, it was deserted. So something else was already going down. And in their stead, we get people like the Urartians, who show up in what is now the region of Lake Van, and over there, just to the north of Assyria. And they happily continue on, as do the successors to the Hittites, the lesser branches, what we call the Neo-Hittites, as I say. So there is some transformation, but if I were to take you back to my original table, I have the Hittites in category 5, but I've got the Neo-Hittites up in category 1 or 2. I think it's 2. All right, so don't forget them. All right, and we've got all their names, and this is where the newest and most interesting archaeology is coming from. Sites like Carchemish, sites like Tel Tayanat, up where Turkey meets Syria. You remember the huge and devastating earthquake that hit February? That region. Right. In fact, the workmen for the archaeological expeditions were in the villages, and so everybody did a GoFundMe and all of that. So that's the region we're talking about up there. Neo-Hittites, northern Canaan. And we've got here pretty much flourishing. They're doing okay. So I put them in a different category. All right. And then I just had to show you because I absolutely love that picture. I mean, there you go. That's your king, Shuppiluliuma II. What? Right. All right, and this is where I'm going to get the most, as I say, pushback from my colleagues. We know for a fact that Egypt withdrew from the region of the southern Levant, what is today Israel, Gaza, and Sinai. They're gone by about 1140. They withdraw back into Egypt proper. And in their stead, we get a lot of new little kingdoms. Kingdom of Israel, Kingdom of Judah, right? Ammon, Edom, and all of that. And these are the ones that the Neo-Assyrians like to pick on. So my question is, what happened to the Canaanites who had lived there, the people that we know from the Amarna letters? And the answer would be they're either wiped out or they're assimilated, right? And if you've read this little book called the Hebrew Bible, you get two different versions in it, the book of Judges and the book of Joshua. One says there's a genocide of the Canaanites. The other one says they assimilate and they all live happily ever after, basically. But the one thing that I would note, and the reason why I put the Canaanites in the lowest category, is after the end of the Late Bronze Age, we never call anybody a Canaanite anymore. Now we call them an Israelite, a Judahite, an Ammonite, an Edomite. So I'm wondering what happened to the Canaanites. And either they get wiped out, in which case they're in category 5, or they have successfully transformed and become these new people, in which case they should be up in like category 2. And I actually say that in the book. Originally I had them in category 2, and then I'm like, nah, and I put them down in 5, right? So because this is where we get things like the Exodus and the Israelite conquest of Canaan and all of the theories of how did the Israelites get there. All right, and there's a number of hypotheses, none of which have been proven, by the way. But one of them, I'll just point out, Israel Finkelstein suggests that the Israelites were already there. They were up in the highlands, and they came down when the Egyptians withdrew. In which case, they're transforming, and they're extremely successful. But if you go with the biblical version and you've got an exodus, then you've got a migration, and you've got a new people coming into the area. So which is it, right? And that's where I think we're going to get into some interesting debates coming along. And other new stuff too. Edom, for example, in Jordan, lots of new high-tech studies about taking over the copper mines there, and in fact giving Cyprus a run for its money. And the site of Olympia, right, where you had the Olympics, there's some huge cauldrons of bronze that were dedicated, and when they analyzed the metal in the bronze cauldrons, the copper comes not from Cyprus, but from Jordan. So they are new in this time period. Okay, so one of the other things that I tried to investigate, and I'll wrap up right here, is why were there differences between these different societies? And that's where the IPCC defines vulnerability and fragility as well. And that's also where I think we come into play. Because some of these were more fragile than others. Some of these were more vulnerable than others. And in a couple of them, it wasn't immediately apparent that they were fragile. So, Mycenaeans and Hittites, are they more vulnerable or fragile than anybody else or not? And I don't want to belabor this point, but basically, each case is unique. And let me just jump here. Anybody remember Colombo? Anybody remember Kojak, right? And then you've got CSI and NCIS, right? We're investigating a cold case. It's 3,200 years dead, right? And we're trying to figure out what happened back then. And I don't think we can. Each thing is going to be a bit different. But some of the newest research is showing that these guys were more fragile and more vulnerable. And I will point you just to one example. The Mycenaeans, towards the end, are doing huge construction projects. If you've been to Mycenae, you've probably seen the famous Lion Gate. That dates to this period. That's 1250 to 1200. There's the draining of the Copaeus Basin. They are using the 99% to build that stuff, and they're probably taking advantage of them. So some of the newest suggestions has been that the Mycenaean peasants were probably happy when the palace went down, right? And one person's misfortune is another one's fortune. So we're now thinking that the Mycenaeans and the Hittites might have been more fragile than they looked. And I would say, again, that's kind of us today. We're thinking, yeah, we're good. We're fine. We're not fragile. are we more fragile than we think? So let me skip to my last right here, the Assyrians, I told you I was going to go too long here. You guys are like one of my first test audiences. I'm like, I got much more than an hour and a half here. You're saying, nah, keep going. All right, so let me jump right here. How do we sum it all up? Everybody's trying to recover, but they each follow their own way. And what I would ask very simply, again, is it really a dark age? And I think, even though I haven't given it too much tonight, I think with the alphabet and iron and all that, I agree with those of my colleagues that say there's no way this is a dark age. And the preference among the archaeologists and ancient historians is now to simply call it the Iron Age, which has no connotations or anything like that. So just like the medievalists don't like you calling their period a dark age anymore, so we don't want it to be a dark age too. So we call it the Iron Age. But I would say then, by way of conclusion, if we look today, is any of this relevant? I would say absolutely. Look at the wildfires that were in California and Greece recently. Remember that ship that blocked the Suez Canal, right? Anybody remember January 6th, right? So we've got stuff that's going on here. And in the end, I ask, are we going to be Mycenaeans or are we going to be Phoenicians? Are we going to be anti-fragile or are we going to drop out? And my conclusion is, I don't know. So I came up with a couple of common sense things, which you could have come up with even without reading the book, right? Have multiple contingency plans in place, redundant systems to fall back on. Be resilient enough to withstand whatever blows may come, strong enough to withstand enemy invasions. Be as self-sufficient as possible, but do call on your friends if you need them. Be innovative and inventive, turning nimbly and transforming. Don't just cope. Prepare for extreme weather conditions. If they come, you'll be ready. If they don't, it won't matter. Be sure to have dependable water resources. Remember, the Assyrians and the Babylonians are on the Tigris and Euphrates. And then last, and this works all through history, keep your working class happy, right? Otherwise, you may pay a price. So, are we currently facing a situation like back at 1177, which is what I asked in the original book, and I ask now again as well? We've got climate change. We've got famines and droughts. We've got earthquakes. We've got rebellions. We have disease. We've got migrants and refugees fleeing war and drought. And I would just remind you, Mark Twain once said, history doesn't repeat, but it sure does rhyme. And I'm seeing a rhyming couplet coming up very, very soon. And on that pessimistic note, I will end and thank you.
We have time for some questions. So let's start with the red microphone.
Well, I'll actually exercise privilege with the microphone and ask a question myself. One of the really interesting excavations that's going on.
Too close.
Too close. Okay. Outside of the ancient Near East that you're looking at over the past like 10 years or so since you wrote the book are the Talens excavations in northern Germany. And for people who might not know about them, if you extrapolate out of them, there was this huge battle of perhaps thousands of men fighting it out in what is now northeast Germany at a time exactly in the period you're talking about. And I'm wondering whether or not is this a way of maybe sort of like, can you tie this in a way to maybe say that the trade networks were even bigger than we thought, that maybe they stretched up all the way up to the Baltic? And if there were people moving around up in Northern Europe, I know in your book you sound very, very skeptical that the Dorians actually existed. Could this be an explanation of like maybe where they were coming from or what their source was?
No to the last one, but so let me take it from the top here. Yes, the interesting battle that you're talking about up in Germany, where they've got literally hundreds of skeletons and all that from this 1200 BC period, give or take. I do think that this is connected in some way, but we have to find the connections. And I do think that we'll be able to expand from where I was working in the globalized Mediterranean and bring in Germany, Scandinavia, and all that. There was also another find of, I think, think it was glass beads and such that were up in a grave in Scandinavia. So I do think we're going to expand it. There's actually a colleague of mine, Barry Malloy, teaches in Ireland, and he has a project looking at 1200 BC in Europe and is finding the connections. So I think we will be able to expand this. Yes, absolutely. As for the Dorians, those of you that have read the original book know that I start out talking about the Sea Peoples. In the sequel, I start out talking about the Dorians. That's the opening of the book. And I describe our usual version of them, that they came down from the north and they invaded Greece with their weapons of iron and they took over from the Mycenaeans. And then I say, but it probably never happened, because it didn't. There's no archaeological evidence for the Dorians whatsoever. It was made up by the later historians, Herodotus, Thucydides, in part to explain the different dialects of Greek that they could see. Now, that doesn't mean there's not a migration. There are migrations, but there's no invasion like that. And most of the archaeologists and the ancient historians, in fact, all of them, would agree. There's no Dorian invasion. The problem is the general public has not learned this. It's all over the internet. And it's in the textbooks, and it's still in the online encyclopedias. And I take one particular encyclopedia, which I will not name here, but I do name in the book, and I take them to task. And what's going to be funny is I actually give the web address for it, in which they say, and then the Dorians came down, and I'm like, no, they didn't. And I gave the web. I guarantee within 3 weeks of the book being published, that web address will have been changed, and they will change the entry. But for now, if you go there quickly, Columbia Encyclopedia, you'll be able to go see what they say. So this is one thing that I wanted to do. My two stated goals to myself were to get rid of the Dorian invasion and to change Dark Age to Iron Age. So those were my two goals with this. Yeah.
Yeah, Andrew Graham, not a member. I'm wondering if the kind of explosion in archaic DNA that has happened since your first book has either updated any of your conclusions or influenced your thinking on this one.
Yes, good question. So the explosion of ancient DNA, yes, it has impacted, influenced, affected my research, and it's going to continue. And it's both good and bad. So I'll give you one example. In the revised edition of the book, I talk about the DNA that was extracted from 4 little infants that were buried under the floors of houses in Ashkelon. They are not Sea Peoples themselves because they're about 100 years later, but they're definitely descendants of the Sea Peoples because the DNA, and I know it doesn't work this way, but it's basically 40% local Canaanite and 60% other. And when the computer models are run, the other, the most likely is Crete, Sicily, Sardinia, and Spain. These are Philistine burials. We can tell this from the pottery and all of that. And these little kids are obviously part Canaanite and part Philistine, and they're coming from Sicily, Sardinia, Spain. So that's one good example. The problem, of course, is that's a sample of 4, which is a little too small, right? So we need more to do it like that. Where we get into problems are these studies that are looking at the ancient bodies and then comparing them to the modern populations there. And you get all kinds of things like, oh, the modern Greeks are descended from the Mycenaeans and Minoans, or the modern day people in Lebanon are descended from the Canaanites. And some of them may be true to a certain extent, and others are just way over the top, nationalistic, everything. So we have to be very careful of how we interpret the results. But ancient DNA, aDNA, is one of the things that we're now seeing in what some of the people are calling a third wave in archaeology with the exact and life sciences. So this is going to be the whole next phase when we're doing this kind of stuff. So yeah, it's already impacted me that I included it in the revised edition, and it's going to keep affecting us from onwards. But again, both good and bad. We have to be very careful with what we do. Yeah.
Blue microphone.
Yes, I'm Frederica Dorima, member. Thank you very much for this nice kind of rendition of the whole history there. You mentioned that the collapse was to a great extent due to drought, prolonged drought, but also in these areas there are earthquakes. And you showed one picture, but then you didn't follow that up. What are the effects of the earthquakes that like the Mycenaean civilization, for example?
Right. So I only showed one picture of that because I was just summarizing, and that I would actually say, I think the first lecture I gave like 5 or 6 years ago, I go into more detail about that. But very quickly, we have evidence for earthquakes that last from, a series of earthquakes from 1225 to 1175. And it's what Amos Knorr at Stanford calls an earthquake storm. When you're talking modern seismology, it's an earthquake sequence, but in antiquity, earthquake storm. And it comes about, for example, and I'm telling some of you what you already know, but like on the North Anatolian fault line, if you have an earthquake and it doesn't release all the pressure in the fault at once, you'll have another earthquake nearby. It might be a couple of days later, it might be a couple of weeks, might be a year later. If that doesn't release the pressure, you'll have another and another and another. The Northern Anatolian fault line, which goes right across Turkey, can take up to 40 or 60 years to unzip completely, and then the pressure starts to accumulate again, and it'll take a couple of centuries. And so, for instance, there's a series of earthquakes in Turkey from 1939 right up until today, and that is that fault line unzipping. So we think we see the same thing in the Mediterranean. And there's a fault line that comes around by the coast of Greece. There's another one that comes right up the Rift Valley, and so on. The whole thing is a hotbed of active seismology. Right. And so the Mycenaeans, for example, in that picture I showed, the famous Lion Gate and the Cyclopean masonry, that's not just bedrock that's built on. It's 1/2 of an earthquake zone. And I remember hearing the stories when the seismologists went to visit Mycenae, they started laughing. And the excavator said, "What are you laughing at?" And they said, "Your precious Mycenaeans built one of their capital cities right on top of an active fault zone. Who does that?" And Amos Knorr said, "I teach at Stanford and I live in San Francisco." Yeah. So we have evidence for earthquakes all over the place. Tiryns, Mycenae, Troy, and now, as I said, some of the new ones, Azekah and others. So I think, again, this is another factor that we should consider. And some of the cities that we can see are destroyed are by Mother Nature, not by humans, right? But some of them are never re-inhabited. Right? So that's a slightly more full picture of the earthquakes.
Yeah, thank you. That's what I was asking.
Yeah.
It's a red microphone. That's you.
My name is Al Ehrlich. I am a member of the society. Forgive my ignorance, but history is replete with the invaders came, they sacked the city burned, the people, whatever. What actually happens? I mean, do the people flee? Are they all slaughtered? And the boat people, for example, where are their children and families? They don't propagate on boats, so they must have a central location to have trees to build boats. So I really don't know how all that works. If you could clarify that somewhat, I'd be grateful.
Sure. So this all comes down to two things: death or migration, right? That's really what it comes down to here. A lot of the people migrate in the aftermath of the collapse. And in fact, a lot of the little kingdoms that I mentioned, the Edomites, the Moabites, archaeologists think that they may have been migrating into the region, including maybe even from Anatolia. So we may see mass movements of people, but we also do see massive amounts basically of death. At one point, the archaeologists thought that the population of Greece between, say, 1300 and 1100 BC, right, just over the collapse, that it had declined by as much as 90%. That's a lot. Nowadays, we've ratcheted it back. Now we're thinking that maybe only 40 to 60% died or migrated. But the population of Greece, which had been about 600,000 people, we think, in 13th century, by the 11th or 10th century, they're down to 300,000. So it's like a 50% decline. Same over in Mesopotamia. I think it was Nicholas Postgate once thought that at least maybe up to 75% of the population had died or maybe moved around. But I think that's where our sea peoples went, is that the kids, the grandkids, they end up settling down and assimilating and basically disappearing. And so, in fact, the newest thinking today of what happened to the sea peoples, well, Ramses III tells us that he defeated them, and he says, I settled them in strongholds in my name. And the strongholds in his name would have been in Egypt and southern Canaan. And that is now where we're thinking that they married and assimilated and essentially disappeared, right? But that's where you get like the 4 little kids. So I would say that it's a combination of death and migration, which accounts for most of the drop in population, or at least the settlement shifts, shall we say.
We're going to go to the web before we go to the red microphone. So can we have a question from our YouTube viewers?
Hello. Okay. So first question is from Paul Hess. He would like to know, well, after the collapse, what specifically was the impediment to trade and communication by sea during the post-collapse period? How reduced was it, and how much did it resume over the following centuries?
So how does the collapse impact the trade routes across the Mediterranean, basically?
Yes.
Yeah. Well, to a certain extent, as I mentioned, at one point, the ships from Ugarit were big in the original trade. But other ships were going around too. The Canaanites, we know, have ships, Mycenaeans, Egyptians. Basically, everybody that gets hit by this collapse, it impacts their navy, it impacts their merchant fleets, it impacts their ability to trade. And even if you are good to trade, like you're a Phoenician, the people on the other side might not be in a position to accept your trade, right? You have to have both sides going to have mutual trade. So basically, at least at first, the trade links are impacted. Let's not say broken, but impacted. And we definitely see a drop in importation. So, for example, my colleague Sarah Murray, who teaches now up at Toronto, did a study of imports into Bronze Age and Iron Age Greece and showed that, yes, there are fewer imports from Egypt and the Near East during the Iron Age in Greece, but she said it's not necessarily because you've got that much less trade. You have just that many fewer people who are trading. So the impact can come in a couple of different ways. What I would see from what I say is the immediate collapse, as I said, broke the globalized network, and it takes time to restore it, right? We see that even today when a supply chain issue comes up or a network is broken. It takes you a while to reestablish it. I would say that that was the case back then as well. So there's an immediate impact, and then you're able eventually to deal with it. So by the 8th century, they're up and running again.
One more question from the web.
Sure.
And let's say hello to AJ in India, who is listening in.
All right. This next question is from AJ. Okay, he says, it would be interesting to look at the interactions between the civilizations discussed and the Indus Valley civilizations and also the Vedic civilizations. And also the influence of Sanskrit and
India.
there was definitely much trade between the Indus Valley and Mesopotamian area. Have you considered that?
Okay, so there's a couple of things going on here, which I'll just try and keep it short. But the Indus Valley and the Harappan civilization, they are definitely trading with the Mesopotamians back in the 3rd millennium. Earlier, like 1,000 years earlier. No problem with that. We've got mentions in the text of Magan and Meluha and other places like that. So we know that the Indus Valley civilizations are trading with Mesopotamia. What happens later in the 2nd millennium is a bit more problematic. There are actually one recent study that came out trying to argue that the monkeys that you see on the frescoes at Santorini, Akrotiri, that the way the tails are held is that they're coming from the Indus Valley. I'm not sure I agree with that. I think they're more likely from Egypt. But the main problem is that in our period, the late 2nd millennium BC, the late Bronze Age, there are very few, if not any, connections with the Indus Valley at that point. Why? Because the Harappan civilization had already gone down. The Harappans are affected by an earlier drought. The one we've been talking about is colloquially called the 3.2 KYA event, right, 3,200 years ago. There is a drought that is 1,000 years earlier, which is the 4.2 KYA event. And that event, which hits between 2200 and 1900 BC, took down the Akkadians, the Harappans, and everybody else back at the end of the early Bronze Age. And this has been documented by, among others, Harvey Weiss at Yale University, who says he's found evidence of that earlier drought on all 7 continents. So that's pretty much global, as far as I can tell, right?
I would say so.
Yeah, I would say so. So the Harappans are already gone by the time we get to the period that I'm talking about. I mean, not gone, you know, there are some people that survive, but Harappan society and civilization is not a part of this globalized network at this time. That's why I don't mention them in the book. That's why they've got no place in it. And that's why I get questions every so often saying, you didn't mention the Harappans. I'm like, yeah, they're not around anymore, right? Just like Mitanni, they're gone, you know, by this point too. So that's the short answer, is if we were doing 3rd millennium, we'd be fine talking about the Harappans in the Indus Valley. But at the end of the 2nd, no, they're gone by then. Yeah.
Yes, my name is James Cole. I'm a new member of the Society. My question is, you've mentioned droughts a lot, but we know that in the Roman era, there was something called the Roman climate optimum. Was there a climate optimum in that age? And if so, did the population at some point peak and then level off and start to go down? And if so, when was that climate optimum?
Interesting.
Okay, so if I'm correct about this, and this is not quite in my specialty, this is also where we're talking about things like solar minimums and solar maximums, yes?
You've talked about periods when things were not going well,
right?
But was there a period where it was regarded, where there was plenty of good harvests, etc., growing population?
Yes, okay, so let me deal with those in the same question. I'll try to be brief. It does look like the period just before the collapse, like the 13th century, maybe back into the 14th century, is a very good period. And in fact, it's been suggested now that it was such a good period, say for the Mycenaeans on mainland Greece, that they may have overexpanded and overexploited everything. And as a result, when things started dropping and not getting as good, they found themselves in a quandary. So that has been pointed out, that it was a very good time before it was a very bad time. So that does help to a certain extent. This is where I went to a conference in 2014, just after my book had come out. A fascinating conference because there was all these geologists there and earth scientists, and they were talking about RCCs, you know, rapid climate change, and they were talking about bond events, and I'm like, we're talking about the same thing, but from 2 different points of view. Because I was looking at it from archaeology, they were looking at it from the earth science. Right, so like in terms of rapid climate change, which many of you know about, these RCCs, there have been, as far as I know, 6 different periods of those during the Holocene. And they mesh with some of the major developments. Like there's one at about the time of the Neolithic Revolution when they domesticate plants and animals. So there is one of these RCCs at just about this time in 1200 BC. There's also something called a Bond event. And when I first read about it, I got very excited. I'm like, Bond? James Bond? No. It turned out that it was the author of the articles whose last name also happened to be Bond. And that happens about every 1500 years also. And in both cases, it's where you get the frigid air from the Arctic and ice and such coming further south than it should. And if you remember the Arctic blasts that we've had the last couple of years, that's it basically. And when they come down that far south, they will change the surface temperature of the sea, like in the Aegean, and that will result in less precipitation. So there's been all kinds of work about this now, and that is one thing. I don't go into it so much in the sequel, but I go into it in the revised version, because the one question I had not asked in the original book was what caused the drought? right? Okay, there's a drought. What caused it? And so in the revised version, I go into it a bit, and I have to admit it was because after I was here, I gave a similar lecture on 1177 at NASA in Greenbelt, and they are going, and they all come up to me afterward. You need to talk about solar minimum. You need to talk about solar maximum. And I'm like, what's that? And I went home and did some research. I'm like, oh my God, I need to talk about this. Right. So in the revised version of the original book, I go into, could it have been, a solar minimum, a solar maximum? But yeah, so I think I've kind of sort of answered your question, but if not, we can talk a bit later. But yeah, that was one of the big questions I had, is what caused the drought? And then the other question was, they've had droughts all the time in that area for time, immemorial. What was it about this drought? Was it longer than usual? And if so, why? And why couldn't they survive it? And again, part of that is speculation, and part of it is, maybe an informed guess. But that's where I think the way forward is we need to be working more between disciplines and get the archaeologists working, with the earth scientists and the geologists and all of that, because we're all looking at the same thing, but from different points of view. It's your proverbial elephant, and I've got the tail, and you've got, the leg, and we really should get together and figure out what the elephant looks like.
Another question from the web, and then we'll go back to the colored microphones.
Okay. This last question is from Gerald Price, who is a member. So these cultures that collapsed, e.g., 1177 BC and following, can mathematical models using set theory, category theory, group theory, etc., provide useful insight in this area?
Good question, and I have no idea.
Okay.
We haven't done that, but what we did just do, which was absolutely fascinating to me, there was a conference at Princeton back in 2019 on collapse, and we all gave different presentations, and I gave my 1177. And afterward, a couple of people from the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers came up to me and said, we want to work with your stuff. We think we've got something. And what they did was go through 1177 and basically assign a number to every time that you could see a direct trade connection, every time you could see a direct diplomatic connection, and so on. And then they took that and ran the computer model through, it was all sorts of things. I mean, they ran it through the computer to find out if we could determine in what order did those 8 societies fall that would have caused the network to collapse. And they ran it again and again. Would it have taken 2 falling at the same time? Would it have taken 3? What would have happened if the Mycenaeans had fallen first? And they ran through it, and the answer was that the only way that the collapse could have happened as we see it is if the Hittites and Ugarit had collapsed almost simultaneously, or one right after the other. None of the other permutations work. It's only the Hittites and Ugarit. When those 2 fall simultaneously, the whole network collapses, which I thought was really interesting, and it was just published last month. It was just published in January. So I'm not lead author or anything like that. I'm just one of the many peons listed, but absolutely fascinating. If you want to, I can give you guys the reference, but that is what we've done. So none of what you just said, but computer modeling. And again, this is the next thing that we need to use, is the computer modeling, which is one way to go.
Timothy Thomas. I'm a member of the society. I'm curious about the role, really, of women in these events. I'm wondering whether tracking jewelry, whether luxury products consumed by women, they're moved around this network and they last very well in the ground. So I'm wondering if that reveals anything about the condition and role of women throughout this process.
Yes, it does to a certain extent, yes. The problem is, of course, the accident of archaeology. What you find is what you find. But we can also use texts as well, the inscriptions. And it not always in a good way, if we go back to the Bronze Age, the Linear B text mention quite a few women who are working in things like the flax industry, the weaving industry, and they give their names, and they seem to be captives that were captured from raids on the western coast of Anatolia, like the Trojan War type of thing. And so it looked like they're slaves, which is not good for them, but at least gives us some idea of the role of those women. But that's the Bronze Age. In the Iron Age, we have a couple of circumstances, like I'm thinking of, there's a couple of tombs that were found of Neo-Assyrian princesses or queens that were found 15, 20 years ago, right, with gorgeous gold jewelry and all of that. And so, but that's unusual, right, because most of that would have been kept in circulation or melted down or something like that. So a lot of what we've got then are the text, and again, not necessarily in a good way. Again, I'll give you just one example. The Neo-Assyrian kings, when they record their campaigns, and they record, I captured 50 cities and this and that and the other, they also record the tribute that they got. And in among all the gold and the copper and the silver and this and that, they frequently list the women. And included in that is the daughter of the king of so-and-so, and they took her as tribute also. So we've got that as well. So yeah, so I don't deal with that in my book, nor am I able to deal with the 99% of the lower, but the data is there. And so we can do studies of that. We won't have a complete picture, but we'll have at least snapshots.
Last question, red microphone, wherever it is.
Thank you very much. Charlie Hutner, I'm a member. And this might be a little bit of a sidebar, but I know the Assyrians conquered the 10 tribes of Israel after the split. Is there any research that shows where they went?
Yes. Yes, absolutely. Okay, so the question is that we know the Neo-Assyrians captured the northern kingdom of Israel. Yeah, there's a big question, though. Did they do it in the year 722 or the year 720? And was it Shalmaneser or Sargon that did it? There's a big debate in there. But yes, the Neo-Assyrians definitely took over, and that's where the 10 lost tribes of Israel come from. You're correct. Yes, we know exactly where they went. The Neo-Assyrians tell us. They took them back to Assyria. But there were later texts that inserted some confusion in there, including one much later text that said the 10 tribes were taken off to, I think, a land called Azeroth. But if you look at it, Azeroth just means another land. Like, okay, fine. Right, so they basically took them to Assyria, which is the same thing that happened in the Babylonian captivity, where the Babylonians took them there as well. Now, two things, though, I will say. That is not in this sequel, because I end it before then, but the good news is it will be in the third book of this unintended trilogy, because I'm now starting work on the third book, which is called After 1177. But if you're interested now, I've already dealt with this, though. I had a book that National Geographic published in 2007 called From Eden to Exile, Unraveling Mysteries of the Bible. And what happened was I was a consultant on a TV series that Nat Geo did back then called Science of the Bible. Sometimes it appears as Mysteries of the Bible. And I had said to them at the end of the series, you need somebody to write a book for the interested viewers who want to keep reading about it. And they said, great idea. Do you know anybody who can do it? Yeah. Hello, right? So that book, From Eden to Exile, which came out in 2007, are my answers to the 7 questions I'm asked most frequently in terms of biblical archaeology. Where are the 10 lost tribes? Where's Noah's Ark? Where's the Ark of the Covenant? Did Joshua actually capture Jericho and all that? So I have an entire chapter devoted to where are the 10 lost tribes. And the other answer is some of them were taken away, but probably only about 40%. The rest stayed on either the land and intermarried with the people that the Assyrians brought in, because they did deportation and reportation, right? Conquer a people, move them, they're not going to rebel. So they get intermarried with the new people that come in, but a number of them also flee south, and they flee into the kingdom of Judah, which in the decades between 720 and 700 goes up tenfold. The population of Jerusalem increases like 15 times in those 20 years. Of course, the problem is hard on the heels, in come the Babylonians and take out Jerusalem by 586. So anyway, so that's where your 10 lost tribes went. Some went to Assyria, some stayed in Israel, which wasn't Israel anymore, and some went south to Judah. That's why, though, they're called the 10 lost tribes of Israel. They're not lost, but Israel was, because the northern kingdom was assimilated into the Assyrian Empire and was no longer the northern kingdom.
One of the
Okay.
sort of sidebars to that is I've heard this conspiracy theory that the tribe of Dan went to Denmark.
Yeah, I love it. I buy it. Yeah, sure. Absolutely.
Okay, that's the last question. I thank you all for your patience. I would continue, but it's late. Before you go, we have a few tokens of appreciation for you. Framed copy of the announcement of your talk. That would be that. And a rosette, PSW rosette, emblazoned with the 3 bars, evoking the symbol for inductance, which was studied by our founder, Joseph Henry, and a signed copy of Volume 1 of the Philosophical Society's bulletin, which will tell you who founded the society, why they founded it, and has a few interesting reports that I'm sure you'll enjoy reading.
Thank you.
We were talking earlier, I don't know which members who were founders were actually professors at George Washington University, which, as you pointed out, was founded,
50 years
50 years earlier.
Yeah.
But it's not a society, so we're still
It's a
the oldest society. So,
Good.
thank you very much.
Thank you. Pleasure. All right.
Before you go, we got a few closing announcements. The next lecture, the 2,492nd meeting, will be on March 22nd. The speakers will be Thomas Kerr and James Trebitz, both with the Office of Undersecretary of Defense, and they'll be speaking on directed energy weapons such as lasers and microwaves. And we'll address the question, are they finally ready to provide some real military capabilities at a time when drones are changing what's going on the battlefield and the economics of doing battle. The 2,494th meeting will be on April 19th. 2,493rd meeting will be on April 5th, and the speakers yet to be determined. The 2,494th meeting will be on April 19th. The speaker will be Richard Pyle of the Bishop Museum in Hawaii. He's well known for studying corals, not just any corals, but corals at depth. And he does it using highly technical scuba gear that allows him to go down to almost 200 feet, 300 feet, pretty deep. Anyway, it's going to be a very interesting talk. We're doing that with the Washington Academy of Sciences. So it should be a good time to meet members of the Washington Academy of Sciences as well as other PSW members. The 2,495th meeting will be on May 3rd, and the speaker will be David Spergel. David's a physicist, and he is the current president of the Simons Foundation, which also funds the Flatiron Institute, and for those of you who get Quanta, publishes Quanta, and has a nice website with videos, quite different than what we do, that treat a lot of interesting science topics. The 2,496th meeting will be the annual Joseph Henry Dinner, and the lecture will be on May 17th. And the speaker will be Brent Sales of the University of Kentucky. And it's a complement in some ways to tonight's lecture. He'll be speaking on success reading ancient scrolls uncovered at Pompeii using X-ray, computer tomography, and artificial intelligence. And if you look up on the web and see little blurbs about what he's done, these scrolls are burnt, and they are congealed, and they can't be unrolled. And so this technique is basically reading these things in their native state using some pretty sophisticated and highly resolution X-ray tomography. But that by itself is not enough, because the difference between the stuff the scrolls are made of, that what the writing is on, and the ink itself is not that great. So you have to use some tricks. And then they had a contest, and they asked people to decipher the data. And three young guys, spread out all over the world, we're able to apply artificial intelligence techniques, and we're able to actually read 3 pages. So this promises to be perhaps a real revolution in what we know about the ancient world, because there are probably thousands of these scrolls in Pompeii that nobody's wanted to even excavate because they're so fragile and nobody could figure out how to read them. Well, let's see. Then we have a personal favorite of mine is on May 31st, the 2497th meeting. The speaker will be Masaharu Subakura, and he'll be speaking about the health effects of the Fukushima nuclear disaster and the effects of efforts to deal with it. And the 2498th meeting will be on June 14th. The speaker will be former NASA Administrator Mike Griffin, who's currently the co-CEO of Logic and recently testified for a different scaled-back approach to landing the U.S. on the moon again. I have to say, it may be that by that time his talk will be kind of superseded by success of SpaceX's Starship, but we'll see. And then the final meeting of the year will be the 2499th meeting on June 28th, and tentatively the speaker will be Ben Schneiderman, and he'll be speaking on human-computer interfaces or some related topic. If you are not a member, we invite you to join. It's a very easy form to fill out. You just go to the web page. There's a join button at the upper right-hand corner. Press that button, fill out the form, tell us a little about yourself. Everybody who has a genuine interest in science is welcome to join, and the price of admission is still $75, unchanged for more millennium than I can remember. And with that, let's thank the people who worked to make this evening possible. I would like a motion to adjourn the meeting. A second? All in favor? Aye. Anyone against? Okay, I now adjourn the 2491st meeting to the social hour. There should be some refreshments at the back of the room.